If the front wheels of a car lose traction with the road surface while attempting to steer, the car enters a state known as understeer. Understeer is always bad and never intentionally used in any rally driving technique. In fact, some of these techniques are used specifically to avoid understeer. Understeer occurs if traction has been partially lost. The car will continue to corner, but at less of an angle than the direction of the front wheels. The car will feel like it is pushing forward. In this situation, applying more steering angle often makes the situation worse, as doing so requires even more traction than was initially being asked of the front tyres. If the wheels have entirely lost traction, the car will cease turning and will slide in the direction it was travelling before the wheels locked. This is particularly common while steering under heavy braking, as the traction of the tyre is being used partly to slow the car down and partly to turn. The correct response is to stop any input to the brake and accelerator and reduce the steering angle. This allows the weight of the car to settle and traction to be regained. On loose surfaces such as gravel and snow, there is an increased chance of understeer due to the reduced level of grip, so techniques are often used to induce oversteer to prevent the car from understeering in the first place. Front-wheel drive cars are particularly prone to understeer as all braking, accelerating and turning forces go through the front tyres. Understeer can occur while accelerating if the combined forces of accelerating and steering overcome the traction available. A similar loss of traction can occur due to braking and steering. Rear-wheel drive cars are least prone to understeer as the front tyres are only used to brake and turn. In fact, their characteristics are more prone to oversteer. Four-wheel drive cars tend to exhibit the characteristics of front-wheel drive cars under braking on corner entry and rear-wheel drive cars under acceleration on corner exit. Rally teams work hard to reduce these characteristics and give a more balanced setup. Remember, understeer is always bad. When rally driving, make sure you try and avoid it at all costs. If the rear wheels of a car lose traction with the road surface while attempting to steer, the car enters a state known as oversteer. This is when the angle of the car exceeds that of the steering input and the rear of the car steps out of line with the front. Unlike understeer, oversteer is often used as a technique to increase the speed at which corners can be taken. By proactively eliminating understeer, a higher exit speed can be achieved. How oversteer is induced and controlled depends on the type of drivetrain in the car. By definition, front-wheel drive cars do not have any drive to the rear wheels. Therefore, oversteer cannot be induced by applying the throttle, but can be induced by using weight transfer. Once a front-wheel drive car enters oversteer, the attitude of the car can be controlled by steering with opposite lock, accelerating, decelerating, or braking. Applying opposite lock while accelerating will effectively speed up the front of the car and will bring the rear of the car back in line. If more oversteer is required, for example if the corner is tighter than expected, decelerating or braking will increase the amount of oversteer by maintaining the weight over the front wheels and therefore reducing the grip on the rear. As the rear wheels of a four-wheel drive vehicle are powered, you can also induce and maintain oversteer by using the throttle to spin the wheels. Depending on the ratio of power delivery between front and rear wheels, the car may have a tendency to oversteer more or less on corner exit. If the ratio is biased towards the front, under acceleration the car may pull itself out of oversteer. However, if the ratio is biased toward the rear, applying power may increase oversteer by spinning the rear wheels. Subtle control of the steering, throttle and brake is used to initiate, maintain and exit oversteer, and the same weight shifting techniques apply to four-wheel drive as for front-wheel drive cars. Unlike front and four-wheel drive cars, rear-wheel drive cars require the opposite technique with regard to throttle control during oversteer. Oversteer can be induced and maintained by weight transfer, but also by applying power to break the traction of the rear wheels. Once oversteer has been initiated, continuing to apply power will maintain the slide. In order to limit or correct oversteer, throttle input must be reduced. Lift-off oversteer occurs when, during cornering, you lift off the throttle. Because the car is slowed by engine braking, there will be a certain amount of longitudinal weight transfer, which will unload the rear tyres, causing them to partially lose traction with the road. In a front-wheel drive car, this weight transfer alone is enough to induce oversteer, because the front of the car is usually heavier than the rear. In four-wheel drive and rear-wheel drive cars, although the difference in the static weight between the front and rear may not be as great as a front-wheel drive car, the effect is amplified by engine braking also acting on the rear wheels as they are unloaded by the weight transferring forward. The key thing to remember is that oversteer is used as a technique to increase the speed at which corners can be taken.